The Galactic Council had existed for 17,000 years, a monument to peace and cooperation among the stars. Within its marble halls and crystalline chambers, hundreds of species debated, traded, and maintained the delicate balance of power that kept the galaxy stable. But humanity's entrance into this ancient institution had been met with barely concealed contempt. When the human delegation arrived at the Council's orbital station above the capital world of Vexara Prime, they came not in sleek vessels of modern design, but in warships that looked like they belonged in a museum. The fleet that escorted Ambassador Gregory Palmer consisted of vessels that seemed impossibly crude to the assembled aliens. Battleships with riveted hulls, destroyers that burned chemical fuel, cruisers whose armor was simple layered steel rather than energy-reactive alloys. The laughter began almost immediately. The Vex, insected beings who prided themselves on their cutting-edge military technology, openly mocked the human vessels in their council broadcasts. The Korath, a reptilian race whose ships could bend spacetime itself, dismissed humanity as barely spacefaring. Even the usually diplomatic Xena found it difficult to hide their amusement at what they perceived as primitives playing at civilization. Admiral Vincent Harris stood on the bridge of the UNS Constitution, a battleship that had been built nearly 3 centuries ago, and watched the alien vessels glide past with their graceful, organic curves and shimmering energy fields. His first officer, Commander Lauren Mitchell, stood beside him, her jaw tight with suppressed anger at the mocking transmissions they'd intercepted. The humans had come to the Council seeking membership, hoping to join the galactic community as equals. They had much to offer. Their worlds were rich in rare elements. Their scientific minds had made breakthroughs in quantum mechanics that even the ancient races found impressive, and their diplomats were skilled negotiators. But none of that mattered to species who judged worth by military might and technological superiority. Ambassador Palmer endured 3 weeks of condescending negotiations. The council representative spoke to him as one might address a clever child, praising humanity's quaint achievements while making it clear that true membership would require humanity to prove itself worthy. The Vex representative, Commander Zixtha, had been particularly dismissive, suggesting that humanity would be better served as a protectorate under Vex guidance rather than as independent members. The insult burned, but Palmer maintained his diplomatic composure. He had been a naval officer before becoming a diplomat, and he understood that sometimes battles were won not through immediate confrontation, but through patience and strategic positioning. Everything changed when the Kryn arrived. The Kryn Dominion had been a dark legend whispered about in the outer regions of Council space for decades. A race of silicon-based warriors who consumed worlds for their mineral resources. They had been quiet for nearly a century, rebuilding their forces in the galactic void. Now they returned with a fleet that numbered in the thousands, sweeping through the outer colonies like a plague. The Council's military forces mobilized, confident in their superiority. The Vex deployed their phase ships, vessels that could exist partially out of normal space. The Korath brought their gravity-manipulating dreadnoughts. The Xena contributed their swarm fleets, millions of small craft controlled by hive mind pilots. Together, they represented the might of 17,000 years of advancement. They met the Kryn at the Epsilon sector, a region of space dotted with mining colonies and agricultural worlds. The battle that followed was broadcast across the galaxy, and what the Council species witnessed shook their certainty to its core. The Kryn ships were massive, crude things of dark metal and burning engines, but they were numerous and utterly relentless. More importantly, they were resistant to almost every advanced weapon the Council possessed. Phase weapons slipped around their hulls without effect. Gravity manipulation barely slowed them. The swarm tactics of the Xena resulted in horrific casualties as the Kryn point defense systems tore through the smaller craft like tissue paper. The Council fleet was forced into a fighting retreat, abandoning colony after colony as the Kryn advanced. Billions of civilians were evacuated, but millions more were left behind as the Council's forces proved unable to hold the line. In the halls of the Council station, panic began to replace arrogance. Emergency sessions were called, ancient defense pacts were invoked, and in a gesture that reeked of desperation, they turned to the humans. Ambassador Palmer received the summons to the council chambers with a carefully neutral expression. Beside him, Captain Derek Stone, the Marine commander assigned to the embassy's security detail, allowed himself a thin smile. They both knew what was coming. The council chamber was a vast space, designed to accommodate hundreds of different species and their various environmental requirements. Palmer stood in the human gallery, a modest platform compared to the grand tiers occupied by the elder races, and waited. High Counselor Thane of the Xena spoke first, his translated voice carrying a note of strained diplomacy. Ambassador Palmer, the council recognizes that humanity possesses certain unique attributes. We understand your vessels, while outdated by our standards, utilize what you call kinetic and explosive weaponry rather than energy-based systems. Palmer nodded slowly. That's correct, High Counselor. Our weapons technology developed along different lines than most spacefaring species. We focused on refined versions of gunpowder-based propulsion and shaped explosive charges rather than energy manipulation. Zixtha of the Vex interjected, unable to keep the disdain from his voice even now. Primitive chemical reactions. However, the Kryn seem resistant to our more sophisticated weaponry. We would request that humanity contribute its vessels to the defense effort. Perhaps your crude cannons might serve some purpose where our superior technology has encountered unexpected difficulties. The chamber fell silent. Every eye, lens, and sensory organ focused on the human ambassador. This was the moment where humanity could prove itself, where they could earn a place at the table through blood and sacrifice. It was also the moment where they could demand a price for that sacrifice. Palmer let the silence stretch, watching the assembled aliens shift uncomfortably in their seats, tanks, and suspension fields. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and measured. The United Nations of Earth would be honored to assist the Galactic Council in this crisis. However, I must be frank with you all. You have spent 3 weeks telling us that our ships are relics, that our technology is primitive, that we are barely worthy of recognition. Now you ask us to risk those ships and the lives of our crews because your advanced weapons have proven ineffective. Thane's translator carried a note of embarrassment. The Council acknowledges that our initial assessment may have been incomplete. We recognize now that technological diversity has value. Then let me propose terms, Palmer said, his diplomatic mask slipping to reveal the steel beneath. Humanity will commit our entire expeditionary fleet to the war effort. We will place ourselves under the overall strategic command of the Council Military Authority, but in exchange, we require 3 guarantees. He held up one finger. First, immediate full membership in the Galactic Council with all rights and privileges. No probationary period, no second-class status. A murmur ran through the chamber, but no one objected outright. Palmer raised a second finger. Second, access to Council navigation data, star charts, and intelligence networks. If we're going to fight, we need to know the territory and the enemy. Zixtha clicked his mandibles in annoyance but nodded. And third, Palmer raised a third finger, his voice hardening, operational independence for human tactical commanders. You want our ships and our weapons? Fine. But our admirals and captains will prosecute this war according to human military doctrine, not be micromanaged by officers who have spent 3 weeks laughing at our capabilities. The chamber erupted in protests, but High Counselor Thane raised a crystalline appendage for silence. After a brief conference with the other senior counselors, he turned back to Palmer. The Council accepts your terms, Ambassador. Humanity is hereby granted full membership. Your fleet will have the operational independence you request. We hope you understand the gravity of what you're undertaking. Palmer's expression didn't change. We do, High Counselor. Humanity has fought extinction-level wars before. We know exactly what's at stake. 3 hours later, Admiral Vincent Harris received his orders. The human fleet, all 47 vessels that had been dismissed as museum pieces, began their burn toward the Epsilon sector. As they accelerated, Harris stood in the Constitution's Combat Information Center, surrounded by holographic displays showing the tactical situation. Status of the fleet, he asked Commander Mitchell. "All ships report ready, sir. The Lincoln and the Washington are having some issues with their main batteries, but engineering expects them sorted within the hour. The destroyer screen is in formation, and our supply ships are keeping pace." Harris nodded, studying the sensor data on the Kryn fleet. Thousands of contacts, each one larger than anything in the human fleet except for their 3 remaining battleships. The aliens had been right about one thing. By their standards, human warships were hopelessly outmatched in size and sophistication. But Harris had read the battle reports from the Council's engagement. He'd seen how the Kryn ships absorbed energy weapons, how they shrugged off matter disruption beams and phase torpedoes. And he'd noticed something that the arrogant alien commanders had apparently missed. "Commander, pull up the damage assessment data from the Council fleet's attack runs." Mitchell complied, and together they studied the holographic recreations of the battle. The Kryn ships had been struck by thousands of weapons, most passing harmlessly through or around their hulls. But there, in the corner of the sensor data, were a handful of successful hits. "There," Harris pointed. "That Koreth dreadnought managed to ram one of the Kryn vessels. The physical impact caused significant damage." "Confirmed, sir. And here, a Vex phase ship materialized partially inside a Kryn hull. The overlap caused a catastrophic failure in both vessels." Harris allowed himself a cold smile. "They're resistant to energy weapons because their hulls are designed to disperse or absorb that kind of attack, but they're not resistant to good old-fashioned kinetic force. They're just big chunks of metal and mineral compounds. And we specialize in throwing very heavy objects at very high speeds," Mitchell finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Exactly. Get me a channel to all ships. It's time we reminded the galaxy why humans spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of making things explode." The human fleet entered the Epsilon sector 6 days later, burning hard on chemical rockets that the aliens considered hopelessly inefficient. They found the Kryn laying siege to the colony world of Thera VII, a Xena agricultural planet that housed nearly 2 billion civilians. The Council fleet had formed a defensive perimeter around the planet, their ships taking heavy losses as they tried desperately to hold the line. Even as the human ships approached, 3 Koreth dreadnoughts were overwhelmed and destroyed, their crews fighting to the last as the Kryn focused their fire. Admiral Harris watched the carnage and felt a cold fury settle over him. These aliens might have laughed at humanity, but they were still sentient beings fighting for their homes and families. That made them allies worth dying for. "All ships, this is Admiral Harris. We're going to do this by the numbers. Battleship Group will advance to engagement range and demonstrate what 16-inch guns can do to an overconfident enemy. Cruiser divisions, prepare for broadside runs. Destroyer screen, ready torpedo spreads. And let's show these Kryn bastards why humanity stopped building warships like these only because we ran out of enemies that needed them." The UNS Constitution led the battleship group forward, her 2 sister ships, the Declaration and the Valiant, flanking her in a wedge formation. Behind them came 8 heavy cruisers, their triple turrets trained on the enemy fleet. The destroyer screen fanned out on the flanks, their smaller guns and torpedo tubes primed and ready. The Kryn detected the approaching human fleet and immediately dispatched a squadron to intercept. 50 massive warships broke formation and burned toward the humans, their commanders confident that these primitive vessels would be crushed as easily as the Council forces had been. They closed to what the Kryn considered optimal firing range, their energy weapons charging for a devastating alpha strike. And that's when they learned the first lesson in human warfare. Engagement range is determined by the side with the longer reach. The Constitution's forward turrets elevated slightly, computer-guided systems calculating trajectory, enemy velocity, and a dozen other factors. Then, with a flash and a thunderous roar that echoed through the vacuum as overpressure waves radiated from the guns, the first salvo fired. Each 16-inch shell was a self-contained missile, a 1-ton projectile of hardened steel and high explosives traveling at 3,000 meters per second. The salvo of 9 shells crossed the distance to the Kryn fleet in seconds, and 4 of them found their mark. The lead Kryn warship's hull, designed to absorb and dissipate energy, proved utterly unprepared for the kinetic impact. The shells punched through the outer armor, their momentum carrying them deep into the vessel before their explosive charges detonated. The massive ship shuddered, atmosphere venting from a dozen hull breaches, internal fires consuming entire sections. Before the Kryn could react, the Declaration and Valiant added their fire. More shells screamed across the void, and more Kryn ships reeled from impacts they had no defense against. Energy shields that could turn aside particle beams and deflect laser fire might as well not have existed against solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. The cruiser divisions joined the assault, their 8-inch guns and smaller caliber batteries finding range. The destroyer screen launched their torpedoes, not the sophisticated seeking weapons of the Council fleets, but simple rocket-propelled warheads carrying enough conventional explosives to crack open a small moon. The Kryn squadron, so confident moments before, found itself in a nightmare scenario. They returned fire, their energy weapons striking the human ships, but the layered steel armor that had seemed so primitive absorbed the damage far better than the exotic alloys of Council vessels. Where energy fields failed and reactive armor boiled away, simple metal plating just got hot and kept protecting the vital systems beneath. Admiral Harris watched 3 of his destroyers take heavy fire, their hulls glowing red from sustained energy strikes, but they kept fighting, kept firing, their crews working frantically to manage damage and maintain combat effectiveness. "All ships, advance and reload. Let's keep the pressure on," Harris ordered. "Damage control parties, give me status reports." As the human fleet pressed forward, the remaining Kryn ships in the intercepting squadron tried to retreat, but the humans had closed to knife fighting range. The cruisers raked them with sustained fire, their rapid-fire batteries hammering at already damaged hulls. The destroyers darted in close, firing torpedoes at point-blank range before peeling away. Of the 50 Kryn ships that had broken formation to face the primitive humans, only 12 managed to escape back to their main fleet. The others were destroyed, crippled, or captured by Marine boarding parties who crossed the void in armored shuttles and secured the vessels through brutal corridor-to-corridor fighting. The main Kryn fleet, numbering over 3,000 ships, turned to face this unexpected threat. For the first time in their conquest of Council space, they faced an enemy that could hurt them, and their response was to commit overwhelming force. But Admiral Harris had expected this. As the Kryn fleet began its ponderous turn, he issued a new series of orders. All ships, execute pattern Sierra 7, battleship group, maintain heading and continue engaging targets of opportunity. Cruiser divisions, break formation and execute harassment runs. Destroyer screen, scatter and hunt. The human fleet dissolved from a coordinated formation into what looked like chaos. Individual ships and small groups broke away, each following independent tactical plans, but all working toward the same strategic goal: to inflict maximum damage while avoiding getting pinned down by the Kryn's superior numbers. The Constitution and her sisters continued their advance, their main batteries firing in carefully timed salvos that kept at least one turret always loaded and ready. They targeted the largest Kryn vessels, the command ships and heavy cruisers that coordinated the enemy fleet's movements. Meanwhile, the cruisers demonstrated why human naval doctrine had always emphasized speed and firepower over heavy armor. They swept around the flanks of the Kryn formation, their guns blazing in broadside attacks that crippled ship after ship. When the Kryn tried to respond, the cruisers had already moved, their chemical rockets providing thrust-to-weight ratios that let them maneuver in ways the massive Kryn vessels couldn't match. The destroyers were even more aggressive, operating in pairs or trios to hunt isolated targets. They would close at full burn, launch torpedoes, rake their target with gunfire, and then retreat before the enemy could bring overwhelming force to bear. It was dangerous, brutal work, and humanity lost 7 destroyers in the first hour of combat, but the damage they inflicted was worth the cost. On the bridge of the Constitution, Commander Mitchell monitored the tactical display with growing satisfaction. Sir, Council forces are reporting that Kryn pressure on their defensive line has decreased by 40%. The enemy is having to divert resources to face us. Harris nodded grimly. Good. Order the Lincoln and Washington to join the cruiser harassment runs. I want the Kryn commanders so busy dealing with threats from multiple vectors that they can't coordinate an effective response. Aye, sir. Lincoln and Washington acknowledge and are breaking formation now. The battle raged for 6 hours, the human fleet dancing through the Kryn formation like sharks among whales. Every minute more Kryn ships fell to the sustained assault, their hulls torn open by shells and torpedoes, their systems failing under the brutal kinetic impacts. The Council fleet, witnessing this display of primitive ferocity, began to shift their tactics. The Vex commanders, swallowing their pride, requested permission to coordinate with the human destroyers. The Korath dreadnoughts began using their gravity manipulation not to attack, but to create zones of distorted space that herded Kryn ships into kill zones where human guns could tear them apart. Even the Xena, their swarm tactics previously ineffective, found new purpose in providing targeting data and reconnaissance for the human vessels. What had been a desperate defensive action transformed into a coordinated assault. The Council forces, no longer bearing the brunt of the Kryn attack alone, rallied and pushed forward. And at the center of it all, the human fleet fought with a savage efficiency that made it clear why they had survived and thrived on a death world that had tried to kill them for millions of years. Admiral Harris stood on his bridge, watching the tactical display shift in real time, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The aliens had laughed at his ships, called them relics and museum pieces. They hadn't understood that sometimes. The old ways persisted not because people were too stupid to innovate, but because they worked. All ships, the Kryn command vessel has been identified. It's the large craft at coordinates 73 Mark 9. Battleship group, converge and prepare for coordinated strike. The Constitution, Declaration, and Valiant turned as one, their massive hulls swinging to bring their main batteries to bear on the Kryn command ship. It was a monster, easily 5 times the mass of the largest human vessel, its dark hull studded with weapons and armored in layers of mineral compounds that had proven resistant to every Council weapon system. Range to target, Harris asked. 30,000 kilometers in closing, sir. Enemy vessel is attempting to maneuver away. She can try. Fire when ready. The 3 battleships fired simultaneously, 27 shells arcing across the void in a carefully calculated spread. The Kryn command ship's defensive systems, designed to intercept energy weapons and missiles, proved useless against solid projectiles moving at such tremendous speeds. 21 shells hit home. The impacts were catastrophic. The command ship's hull buckled under the kinetic assault, massive plates of armor cracking and shattering. Internal explosions rippled through the vessel as the high explosive charges detonated, and the mighty warship began to break apart. Without their command vessel, the Kryn fleet's coordination collapsed. Individual ship commanders, used to following orders from their central authority, found themselves adrift in the chaos of battle. Some tried to rally and continue the fight. Others attempted to retreat. A few simply shut down, their silicon-based minds unable to process the loss of hierarchical structure. The human fleet and their Council allies pressed the advantage ruthlessly. Over the next 12 hours, the Kryn fleet was systematically destroyed, captured, or driven from the Epsilon sector. Of the 3,000 ships that had entered the battle, fewer than 400 escaped into the void. The colony world of Thera VII was saved, its 2 billion inhabitants spared from the Kryn's mining operations that would have consumed their world and left them extinct. In the aftermath, Admiral Harris received a communication from High Counselor Thane requesting his presence aboard the Council flagship. He took a shuttle across, accompanied by Commander Mitchell and Captain Stone, and found himself in a situation he'd never quite expected. The senior military commanders of the Galactic Council waiting to greet him with something approaching respect. Zixtha of the Vex approached first, his insectoid body clicking with what Harris had learned to recognize as embarrassment. Admiral Harris, I owe you and your fleet an apology. I called your ships relics. I mocked your weapons as primitive. I was wrong. Harris nodded, accepting the apology without gloating. Commander Zixtha, you judged our capabilities based on what you understood about warfare. In your experience, technological sophistication equals military superiority. But sometimes, simplicity and proven effectiveness matter more than cutting-edge innovation. High Counselor Thane gestured for them to walk together through the flagship's observation deck, where they could see the human fleet maintaining patrol patterns around the liberated colony. Your vessels look the way they do by design, don't they? This isn't just you working with limited technology. That's correct, High Counselor. Humanity went through several generations of warship design. We built energy weapon platforms, experimented with exotic matter manipulation, even developed phase shift technology similar to what the Vex use. But we kept coming back to kinetic weapons and chemical propulsion, because they work reliably in every environment. They're easy to maintain and repair in the field, and an enemy can't develop specific countermeasures against a chunk of metal moving fast enough to punch through anything. A Korath general, her scales gleaming in the observation deck's light, spoke up. But surely your civilization has moved beyond such crude technology in other areas. Your computers, your medical systems, your civilian infrastructure, Commander Mitchell answered, a slight smile on her face. Of course, General. Our civilian technology is as advanced as any council species, but military technology serves a different purpose. It needs to work when everything else has failed, in environments that would destroy sophisticated systems, maintained by scared kids who might have only weeks of training. Our warships look old because reliability and effectiveness never go out of style. Over the following weeks, as the human fleet helped the Council push the Kryn back sector by sector, a profound shift occurred in how the galaxy viewed humanity. The species that had been barely granted membership now found themselves in high demand as military advisors. Council shipyards began retrofitting their vessels with kinetic weapon systems alongside their energy weapons. Young officers from a dozen species requested permission to train with human crews to learn their tactics and doctrine. Ambassador Palmer watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, but also with careful attention to what it meant for humanity's future. In his private quarters aboard the Council station, he met with Admiral Harris to discuss the situation. We've proven ourselves, Palmer said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey, one of the few luxuries he'd brought from Earth. The Council respects us now, but I'm concerned about what comes next. Harris accepted the glass and took a sip, savoring the familiar burn. You're worried we'll become nothing but the Council's attack dogs. They'll expect us to handle every military crisis while they go back to dismissing our opinions on everything else. Exactly. We need to leverage this moment, this goodwill we've earned, into something more permanent. Real political power, not just military reputation. What do you have in mind? Palmer pulled up a star chart, highlighting several sectors of space. These regions are on the Council's frontier, valuable but vulnerable to raids like the Kryn. I want to propose that humanity be given administrative authority over them. We'll defend them, develop them, and integrate them into the Council's economy, but they'll be under human governance, giving us a real power base. Harris studied the map, his tactical mind already assessing the strategic implications. The Council will resist. They'll see it as humanity grabbing territory. Let them resist. We're not asking, Admiral. We're not the desperate newcomers hoping for scraps from the table anymore. We saved billions of their citizens. We stopped an invasion that their vaunted technology couldn't handle. It's time we started acting like the major power we've proven ourselves to be. The proposal was submitted to the Council 3 days later, and as Palmer predicted, it met with resistance from the elder species. But humanity had allies now. The Xena, whose colonies had been saved by human intervention, supported the measure. The smaller species, who had always been marginalized by the great powers, saw an opportunity to back a rising force that might shift the balance of power. The vote was close, but it passed. Within a year, human administrators and military forces were deployed to the frontier sectors. They brought with them not just their warships and tactics, but their approaches to governance, their emphasis on individual rights and democratic institutions, their intolerance for the casual corruption that plagued many council bureaucracies. The changes were profound and not universally welcome, but they were effective, and the frontier sectors flourished under human management in ways they never had under the traditional council system. 5 years after the Battle of Thera VII, as it came to be known, Admiral Harris stood once more on the bridge of the Constitution. The old battleship had been refitted several times now, upgraded systems grafted onto her original frame, but she still bore the scars of that first great battle. Harris wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Beside him, Commander Mitchell had been promoted to captain and given command of one of the new human vessels being constructed in council shipyards. But she'd requested one last cruise aboard the Constitution before transferring to her new ship, and Harris had been happy to grant it. "Do you think they understand now?" Mitchell asked, watching as they passed a council fleet on joint exercises. The alien ships had been modified extensively, their sleek lines now interrupted by the bulges and turrets of kinetic weapon systems. "Understand what, Captain? Why we kept building ships like this? Why we never abandoned the old ways even when we had the technology to move beyond them?" Harris was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think some of them do. The ones who have fought beside us, who have seen what happens when sophisticated systems fail and all you're left with is courage and cold steel. But there will always be species who think they've found a shortcut, some new technology that makes all the old rules obsolete. Until they meet an enemy that technology can't beat." "Exactly. And then they'll need someone who remembers that in war, what matters isn't how advanced your weapons are, but whether you have the will to use them and the wisdom to know when and how." Far below them on Earth, humanity was experiencing a golden age. The wealth and prestige earned through council membership had brought prosperity. Human scientists worked alongside alien colleagues on projects that would have been impossible alone. Human artists and philosophers engaged with ideas from across the galaxy. But in the shipyards above Mars and Luna, in the training facilities on Earth's continents, and the academies on orbital platforms, humanity continued to build and maintain their fleet of Relic warships. They upgraded them, refined them, learned from each engagement and incorporated those lessons. Because humanity had learned a truth that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. Real strength doesn't come from having the most advanced weapons or the most sophisticated technology. Real strength comes from knowing your capabilities, understanding your limitations, and having the will to defend what matters. The aliens had laughed at the Relic fleet, had dismissed humanity as primitives playing at civilization. But when the crisis came, when the advanced technology failed and the sophisticated weapons proved useless, it was those relics that roared to life and saved the galaxy. And humanity would make sure that lesson was never forgotten.